It would be an understatement to say that there have been a lot of devastating battles in human history. The destruction involved in many of these battles is widely known. After all, World War II's Battle of Stalingrad was perhaps the deadliest of all time. The death toll of the battles of Verdun and the Somme are often the focus of entire studies of the First World War. But there have been many, many more absolutely catastrophic battles in history from all corners of the Earth that don't seem to get the same coverage as these more popular ones. And today, we're going to look at 5 of them. In the Western world, much of the focus of the Second World War is understandably from the Western perspective. The invasion of the USSR, the D-Day landings, and the attack on Pearl Harbor are among the most discussed events from history's deadliest war. But far less attention is given to the events that were unfolding in East Asia. What's interesting about the conflict here is that it didn't begin along with the rest of what is generally considered to be a part of World War II with the invasion of Poland, but actually a good couple of years earlier. The Second Sino-Japanese War began in July 1937 with the Empire of Japan unleashing an unprecedented attack into China. The invaders rapidly captured Beijing, Shanghai, even the Chinese capital of Nanjing, where they committed the infamous Nanjing Massacre and continued moving deeper into the heart of China. The next big target was the city of Wuhan, which at the time was one of the largest cities in the country. It also boasted an impressive rail network, having recently established itself as a critical transportation hub in the interior of China. Both sides knew what was coming next, and each took time to prepare for the battle. China redeployed as many as 1.1 million men to the area, many of them coming from Xizhou, which had recently been captured. This brought the total number of Chinese soldiers to around 2 million, divided into several designated war zones within Wuhan. Japan opted to surround the city as much as possible before advancing, hoping to take control of the Huai River and much of the territory north of Wuhan. However, this plan was stopped dead in its tracks by a large-scale scorched earth tactic when China destroyed its own dikes on the Yellow River, causing flooding on a biblical scale that ruined any chance of Japan flanking Wuhan from the north. This strategic move worked flawlessly, and Japan had to come up with a new plan. But the Yellow River flood was not all fun and games. The devastating amount of water that had been released meant certain death for anyone downstream, which meant China had essentially sacrificed thousands of its own people to hold off the Japanese. In total, an estimated 80,000 people drowned in the immediate aftermath, and as many as 500,000 died from the famine that followed the destruction of the farmland. Japan, seeing that Wuhan would not capitulate as easily as the other cities, made a drastic move, passing the National Mobilization Law, which allowed for 2 things. First, the conscription of civilians, and second, an unlimited military budget. The prelude to the main battle took place in the sky as Japan poked and prodded the Chinese defenses. These air battles featured dozens of planes in chaotic dogfights, with American and Soviet volunteers joining the Chinese ranks. These preemptive air battles resulted in resounding Chinese success, but Japan pressed forward nonetheless. In June 1938, Japan made a naval landing in Anqing, marking the official beginning of the Battle of Wuhan. Over the next few months, Japan would throw everything they had at the city, including 400,000 soldiers, hundreds of aircraft, and more than 100 warships. But still, the defenders held strong. The emerging stalemate often only broken when Japan employed the use of chemical weapons, including toxic gas, which had been personally approved by the emperor himself. This was, of course, against all the international agreements that Japan had signed in the years leading up to this, but as one Japanese historian put it, China didn't have any chemical weapons of their own to retaliate with, so why not? After 4.5 months of intense combat, Chinese forces were forced to withdraw. Japan had finally conquered Wuhan, but at immense cost. According to contemporary estimates, the total number of casualties from the battle could be as high as 1.2 million, and this doesn't even include the deaths from the Yellow River flood just before it. And this cost was likely too much for the empire of the rising sun to bear. Despite technically emerging victorious, their momentum had been all but crushed, buying China plenty of desperately needed time to regroup and fortify their remaining cities. This shifted the pace of the war from large battles to smaller skirmishes, which would remain the case all the way until the United States joined the war a few years later. In 1549, Conquistador Hernan Cortes landed on the coast of modern-day Mexico, intending to capture the entire region and claim it for the Spanish crown. Initially, Cortes and his force of a few hundred Spaniards clashed with the locals, but after some time and negotiating, most were actually able to form an alliance. You see, as suspicious as Cortez may have seemed, the vassal states of the Aztec Empire were ready to do just about anything to free themselves from their oppressors. The Aztecs would regularly invade these regions, taking back hundreds or even thousands of their people to be offered as human sacrifices, and many of them saw Cortez as their path to freedom. Building a small army of locals as he went, Cortez continued marching deeper inland, eventually reaching the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. Upon seeing the city, they were absolutely astonished by it. The city was massive, with a population at the time estimated to be as much as 400,000. It was built on islands within a surrounding lake. It was also highly organized, divided into 4 main sections, each of which was divided into 20 districts and filled with all sorts of markets, skilled workers, and agricultural centers. The emperor's palace had more than 100 rooms, multiple zoos, botanical gardens, and even an aquarium. At its center was a massive pyramid dedicated to the worship of their many gods. With all this and more, the city was arguably the peak of civilization in the New World, a place that showcased just how advanced the Americas truly had become. But sadly, not long after the arrival of Cortez, this great city would be reduced to nothing but rubble, all of its treasures looted, all of its people slaughtered. Cortez entered the city in November of 1519, walking across one of the many causeways leading across the lake. The emperor, Moctezuma II, came out to meet him and welcomed him with gifts. This warm welcome is believed by many to be the result of the Aztec belief that Cortez was actually a god, a feathered serpent, a mythical deity that was prophesied to return to Mexico. Some historians dispute that Moctezuma actually believed this, but even if the emperor himself didn't, it's very possible that many others in the city did. Regardless of his friendliness and even offering the throne to Cortez, he was soon taken hostage as the Spanish were heavily outnumbered in the city and needed some assurance that they wouldn't be wiped out at a moment's notice. With the emperor hostage and following his will, Cortez now intended to take control over the capital. In fact, he was already writing to the Spanish crown saying that he was in charge of the city, which was a bit of a fib, but it's not like they could really verify what he was saying. Except, well, no, actually they could. Cortez suddenly got word from a messenger that 13 Spanish ships had just arrived in Cuba, sent by none other than his rival Diego Velázquez, who was under orders to capture Cortez for overstepping his authority during his conquest. When this second Spanish group finally arrived, Cortez left the capital to meet them, and after attacking their leader, convinced many to join his cause under the promise of great wealth from Tenochtitlan. With these new reinforcements, he began heading back to the capital. But things there weren't going as well as Cortez had hoped. He had assumed that he could rule the city by proxy through Moctezuma, but he had no understanding of Aztec government and that the nobility could replace him if necessary, a situation which was looking increasingly likely as tensions began to build between the Spaniards and the Aztecs. This tension came to a head during the festival of Tenochtitlan, while Cortez was absent. During the festival, the Spaniard left in charge, Alvarado, learned of a potential rebellion being planned and decided to strike first. As thousands of Aztecs were dancing to flutes and drums, he closed the gates to their courtyard and surrounded them before initiating a massacre. They then retreated back into the palace, from which they fired their cannons into the growing crowds, triggering a full-blown citywide revolt. There was no doubt that the Spanish were the enemy, and Moctezuma had lost all of his power, with his younger brother being chosen as the new ruler. This was the scene that Cortez returned to in June of 1520, leaving him no choice but to evacuate his men from the capital, an act which nearly resulted in their complete annihilation. They did, however, manage to escape and began fleeing toward the land of his native allies, but the Aztecs were right on his tail, leading to a fierce battle a couple of days later. After snatching victory from the jaws of defeat in this battle, Cortez finally had some time to recover and used these weeks to secure even more alliances from every tribe that had any sort of grievance with the Aztecs. Meanwhile, the first step to his conquest had already begun as smallpox began to spread throughout the capital, likely arriving from the second group of Spaniards. Thousands succumbed to the disease and thousands more from the famine that soon followed. By 1521, Cortez had gathered a massive army consisting of around 1,000 Spaniards and as many as 150,000 locals. Tenochtitlan was then besieged, and while the Spanish were unable to advance into the city, they were able to cut off its food supplies, even turning many of the lakeside towns into new allies. Eventually, Cortez and his men made it into the city proper, pushing the Aztecs into their grand market, where they made their last stand. However, even after their eventual surrender, the natives couldn't resist the chance to avenge generations of oppression, and they stormed the city, massacring untold numbers of men, women, and children. In total, the fall of the city resulted in as many as 350,000 casualties, with this number not even including those that were lost to the smallpox epidemic that preceded the battle, which claimed many thousands more. Over the coming years, the once great capital was essentially dismantled and buried, with Mexico City rising from its ruins. In the 1st century BC, the ever-expanding Roman Republic began to encounter some resistance from the Greek world. Mithridates VI of Pontus had invaded Bithynia, a Roman ally, where thousands of Roman citizens had been murdered. Soon after, Mithridates had recaptured nearly every Greek settlement that had previously been under Roman rule, as well as much of Asia Minor. In response, the Romans declared war and sent Lucius Cornelius Sulla to handle the threat. In 87 BC, Sulla landed in Illyria with around 40,000 soldiers and began marching toward Athens. Upon arriving, he immediately noticed a problem. A portion of the wall that surrounded the city had been removed, leaving an opening between Athens and the port city of Piraeus. This meant that Sulla would need to conduct 2 sieges simultaneously on each city. But he opted to focus more on Piraeus at first, noting that this would cut off all supplies from Athens, which relied on its port. However, besieging Piraeus would first require contending with the Pontic navy, who dominated this part of the Mediterranean. He sent one of his generals to raise a fleet for this front and then got to work on attacking the cities. Sulla's first advance was completely repelled, so he decided to back off and focus on siege equipment. He needed lots of wood for this, and so every tree was chopped down in a huge radius around Athens. With this new approach, he was able to capture the outer walls of Piraeus, but then he only found more layers of inner walls, and he struggled to advance further. It was during this time that Aristian, the ruler of Athens at the time, began to taunt Sulla, sending letters of what would initially appear to be negotiations, but would instead turn out to be him bragging about the glory of Athens and its eventual victory. But while Sulla took his time, scratching his head and thinking of new ways to attack, well, Athens' time was ticking. A few months into the siege, their grain levels had become critically low, with thousands reportedly resorting to eating grass and leather to keep the hunger at bay. As this hunger grew, the Greek determination plummeted, and soon deserters were leaving the city and providing Sulla with crucial information about Athens. More importantly, Sulla found out that a specific part of the city wall on the southwest side of the city was undefended and weak, and so he immediately sent a crew there to bring it down. They succeeded, and a 900-foot section of the wall soon collapsed. Then, after the beginning of the 5th month of a siege, a full-scale attack was launched into Athens under the cover of night. The Romans mercilessly slaughtered the inhabitants of Athens, and every retelling of the story spoke of blood literally flowing down the city streets. Aristian fled to his Acropolis, where he had a few weeks' worth of supplies stored, and began to set in for the long haul. He wouldn't last too long here, though, surrendering after he ran out of water, and he was promptly executed. Meanwhile, in Piraeus next door, its leader Archelaus had fled with his ships, abandoning the city, which Sulla set ablaze. In total, the siege of Athens and Piraeus had an astonishing death toll, perhaps as high as 200,000, with the vast majority of these being civilians. The Romans, on the other hand, had taken barely any casualties. This was a show of force that siding against Rome was a death sentence, a lesson that would not be easily forgotten across the Hellenistic world. At the end of World War II, most countries who had been devastated by the years of conflict went through an intense period of recovery. Things like the Marshall Plan pumped tons of American dollars to boost up the European economy. The Soviets spent years repairing infrastructure and settling into their new seat as a major world power, and Japan swung into one of the most impressive economic booms in all of history. But the same can't be said for China, because the moment one war ended, another one started, or rather, it resumed. The Chinese Civil War began in the late 1920s, fought between the nationalists and the communists. This war had to take an interesting pause, however, when Japan became a common enemy. Momentarily, both sides in the Civil War put aside their differences and defended their homeland, forming a unified army. There were still clashes and disputes between the two sides of the Chinese coin, but with the encouragement of the USSR and USA, no major engagements broke out. However, almost immediately following Japan's withdrawal, there was nothing left to unite the two camps, and the Civil War was back in full swing. This time around, though, the communists had a bit of an advantage. The battles with Japan had been far more deadly for the nationalists, and the communists had gained a lot of popular support for their guerrilla tactics in occupied regions. Not to mention, Stalin had decided to send the Chinese Communist Party nearly all of the Imperial Japanese weaponry that had been captured. Suffice to say, Mao Zedong and his compatriots had the upper hand, and full-scale war broke out once again in early 1946. The focus of this renewed conflict was the region of Manchuria, rich in natural resources, and now that the Soviets had liberated it from Japan, it was ripe for the taking. Both sides rushed for the land, and after a couple of years of fighting, the communists had gained control over the majority of Manchuria, leaving the nationalists holed up in a few remaining strongholds, most notably the city of Changchun. In May 1948, they marched to the outskirts of Changchun, and in just a few days the city was completely encircled, cutting it off from all nationalist supply lines. At first, Changchun was resupplied via airdrops, but increased anti-aircraft presence put quick paid to that. After a few months, the food situation inside the city was getting desperate. Factions of the nationalists began to fight with each other over limited supply drops, while much of the city starved. Refugees trying to leave the city were even forced to turn back by the surrounding communists in an effort to further stretch supplies. Finally, on the 19th of October 1948, Changchun surrendered and the communists took full control of the region. This loss was a major blow to the nationalist cause, who had lost one of their last footholds in northern China, and led to an incredible loss of life within the city itself, with low-end estimates at around 200,000 and high-end estimates at a staggering 450,000. Either one of these numbers is shocking, especially considering that the city had little political connection to either party, and the deaths of civilians did little to further the battle for either side. In fact, many historians believe this is why the locals were treated so poorly by both sides. The horrific casualties in Changchun were completely unknown to the Chinese people for many years, only entering public knowledge upon the release of the book White Snow, Red Blood. The author of the book even compared the siege with the dropping of the atomic bombs, noting that Hiroshima took 9 seconds, Changchun took 5 months. However, this book has since been censored by the Chinese government and its author was arrested in the 90s, so it seems that the horrors of Changchun will probably remain overlooked for many years to come.